Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Spanish-American War, 1898. Now buckle up as we begin. By 1898, Spain's once mighty empire had withered to scattered colonies across the globe. Cuba, the pearl of the Antilles, had been writhing under Spanish rule for decades, with revolutionary fervor burning bright among its people. The United States watched with growing interest as Cuban rebels fought their colonial masters, their sympathy mixed with economic concerns over sugar plantations and strategic positioning in the Caribbean. Yellow journalism in American newspapers fanned the flames of public outrage with sensational stories of Spanish atrocities. President William McKinley faced mounting pressure from Congress and the American people to intervene in what many saw as a righteous cause for liberty. The stage was set for a conflict that would transform America from a regional power into a global empire, while simultaneously delivering the final blow to Spain's colonial ambitions. The USS Maine, a second-class battleship representing American naval might, arrived in Havana Harbor on January 25, 1898, under the pretense of a friendly visit to protect American interests. Captain Charles Dwight Sigsbee commanded the vessel, and its crew of 354 sailors and Marines, who found themselves at the center of rising tensions between Spain and the United States. The Maine's presence was anything but casual. It served as a powerful symbol of American resolve and a warning to Spanish authorities. For 3 weeks, the battleship rocked gently in the harbor while diplomatic cables flew between Washington and Madrid. Cuban revolutionaries saw the warship as a beacon of hope, while Spanish officials viewed it with suspicion and resentment. American newspapers tracked every detail of the Maine's mission, building public anticipation for decisive action. The crew maintained their routine aboard the steel giant, unaware they were floating atop a powder keg that would soon explode into international crisis. Their mundane daily duties would soon be remembered as the final peaceful moments before catastrophe struck. At 9:40 p.m. on February 15, 1898, a massive explosion tore through the USS Maine, splitting the great warship in two and sending flames shooting into the night sky. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows throughout Havana and could be heard miles away. Within minutes, the pride of America's Navy was settling into the harbor's muddy bottom, taking 266 souls with her into the depths. Captain Sigsbee, writing in his cabin at the time of the explosion, was thrown from his chair, but survived to coordinate rescue efforts. Spanish boats rushed to assist the survivors, pulling injured sailors from the oil-slicked waters as burning debris rained down around them. The cause of the explosion remained a mystery. Was it an external mine planted by Spanish saboteurs, or an internal accident caused by spontaneous combustion in the coal bunkers? American newspapers immediately blamed Spanish treachery, while Spanish authorities insisted on their innocence. The disaster provided the spark that would ignite a war, as cries of "Remember the Maine" echoed across America, demanding vengeance for the fallen sailors. The American press erupted in a frenzy of sensational headlines and inflammatory rhetoric following the Maine disaster. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World competed fiercely to publish the most outrageous stories about Spanish brutality and conspiracy. Headlines screamed, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy," and the warship Maine split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine. These newspaper barons understood that war sold papers, and they spared no expense in fanning the flames of public outrage. Illustrations showed Spanish officials plotting in dark rooms while innocent American sailors perished in explosions. The yellow journalism campaign worked brilliantly as American public opinion shifted dramatically toward military intervention. President McKinley found himself under enormous pressure from Congress, the press, and ordinary citizens demanding immediate action against Spain. Even as naval investigators worked to determine the true cause of the explosion, the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The careful diplomacy that might have prevented war was drowned out by the drumbeat of newspaper headlines calling for revenge and justice. President William McKinley faced an impossible political situation as war fever gripped the nation in the spring of 1898. A reluctant warrior who had served in the Civil War and understood its horrors, McKinley initially sought diplomatic solutions to the crisis. He pressured Spain to grant Cuban independence peacefully, hoping to avoid military conflict that could destabilize both nations' economies. However, Spanish pride prevented any meaningful concessions, while American public opinion made neutrality politically suicidal. Congressional leaders from both parties demanded immediate military action, with some threatening to declare war with or without presidential approval. McKinley spent sleepless nights pacing the White House, consulting with advisors and military officials about America's readiness for overseas warfare. The president understood that victory would transform America into a global power, but defeat could shatter the nation's confidence and reputation. On April 11, 1898, McKinley finally bowed to political reality and asked Congress for authorization to use military force to end the conflict in Cuba. The die was cast, and America prepared to enter its first foreign war since the Mexican conflict 50 years earlier. On April 25, 1898, Congress officially declared that a state of war had existed between the United States and Spain since April 21st, retroactively legitimizing military actions already underway. The declaration marked America's emergence from isolationist foreign policy toward active international engagement. Across the nation, young men flocked to recruitment offices as volunteer regiments formed in every state, their enthusiasm far exceeding the military's ability to train and equip them. Regular army forces numbered only 25,000 men, woefully inadequate for overseas campaigns against a European power. The Navy, however, had been modernizing for decades and possessed several powerful battleships capable of challenging Spanish fleets. Secretary of War Russell Alger faced the monumental task of transforming America's tiny peacetime military into an expeditionary force capable of operating in tropical climates thousands of miles from home. Training camps sprouted across the American South as volunteers learned basic military skills, while supply officers scrambled to provide uniforms, weapons, and equipment for the rapidly expanding army. The logistical challenges were immense, but American industrial capacity and organizational skills would soon prove equal to the task of projecting military power across two oceans simultaneously. The Spanish fleet under Admiral Pascual Cervera Whytopete faced an impossible strategic situation as war erupted across the Atlantic. Spain's once formidable navy had declined dramatically due to budget cuts and technological stagnation, leaving Cervera with only 4 armored cruisers and 3 destroyers to defend an empire spanning 2 oceans. The admiral understood his ships were outgunned and outnumbered by the modern American fleet, but Spanish honor demanded he attempt to break the blockade of Cuba. Cervera's squadron departed the Cape Verde Islands on April 29th, steaming westward toward an uncertain fate in Caribbean waters. American naval intelligence tracked the Spanish movement, creating panic along the eastern seaboard as citizens feared bombardment of coastal cities. The Spanish admiral chose Santiago de Cuba as his destination, hoping to find coal and supplies while avoiding decisive battle with superior American forces. However, entering Santiago's narrow harbor would prove to be a strategic trap from which escape would become nearly impossible. Cervera's brave but doomed voyage represented Spain's final attempt to maintain its colonial empire through naval power, setting the stage for a climactic battle that would determine the war's outcome. Commodore George Dewey received his orders to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines while his Asiatic squadron was stationed in Hong Kong. The ambitious naval officer had spent months preparing for this moment, studying charts of Manila Bay and gathering intelligence about Spanish defenses. Dewey's force consisted of 6 warships led by his flagship Olympia, a modern protected cruiser that outclassed anything in the Spanish Pacific Fleet. On April 27th, the squadron departed Hong Kong under cover of darkness, steaming south toward the Philippine archipelago 650 miles away. Dewey faced significant unknowns about Spanish minefields, shore batteries, and the number of enemy vessels waiting in Manila Bay. His ships carried enough coal and ammunition for extended operations, but they would be completely cut off from American supply bases once battle commenced. The Commodore addressed his crews before entering combat, reminding them that America's reputation and the Navy's honor depended upon their performance in the coming engagement. As the American warships approached Luzon Island, lookouts spotted the lights of Manila in the distance, marking the beginning of what would become the war's most decisive naval battle and America's first step toward becoming a Pacific power. At dawn on May 1, 1898, Commodore Dewey's squadron entered Manila Bay and engaged the Spanish Pacific Fleet in a battle that would reshape the balance of power in the Far East. The American ships advanced in single file past the Spanish shore batteries at Cavite, which opened fire with thunderous salvos that sent geysers of water skyward, but caused little damage. Dewey's vessels responded with devastating accuracy, their modern guns systematically destroying the outgunned Spanish fleet anchored in shallow water. The Spanish Admiral Patricio Montoya had positioned his ships near shore hoping that survivors could swim to safety, but this defensive posture made them sitting ducks for American gunnery. After 2 hours of intense bombardment, Dewey ordered a temporary withdrawal to redistribute ammunition and assess damage, famously telling his flag captain, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." When the Americans resumed their attack, the Spanish resistance crumbled rapidly. By noon, the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed or captured, while American casualties were remarkably light. Only 8 men wounded and no ships lost. The stunning victory eliminated Spanish naval power in the Pacific and delivered the Philippines into American hands, marking the United States' emergence as an Asian power. The American invasion of Cuba began with the landing at Daiquiri and Siboney in June 1898, as General William Shafter's V Corps attempted to establish a foothold on the island's southeastern coast. The operation was hampered by inadequate planning, insufficient transport vessels, and the chaotic process of unloading men and supplies through heavy surf onto hostile beaches. Regular Army units, National Guard volunteers, and Roosevelt's Rough Riders crowded aboard converted merchant ships that lacked proper facilities for military operations. Many horses and mules were pushed overboard to swim ashore, with numerous animals drowning in the process. Spanish forces offered little resistance to the initial landings, withdrawing inland to prepare defensive positions around Santiago de Cuba. The tropical heat and humidity immediately took their toll on American soldiers unaccustomed to Caribbean conditions, while inadequate medical supplies led to outbreaks of typhoid fever and dysentery. Despite these logistical nightmares, American forces successfully established their beachhead and began advancing towards Santiago, where Spanish General Arsenio Liñas waited with approximately 12,000 troops manning strong defensive positions. The real test of American military capabilities lay ahead in the jungle-covered hills surrounding Cuba's second-largest city. Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders became the most famous unit of the Spanish-American War, though their celebrity status often overshadowed the contributions of other American forces. Roosevelt, serving as lieutenant colonel under Colonel Leonard Wood, had recruited an eclectic mix of Harvard graduates, Western cowboys, Native Americans, and adventure seekers for his volunteer cavalry regiment. The unit's colorful composition made excellent newspaper copy, but their military effectiveness was initially questionable due to minimal training and the decision to leave their horses in Florida due to transport shortages. The Rough Riders landed in Cuba as dismounted cavalry, carrying their distinctive campaign hats and an assortment of personal weapons that violated military standardization. Roosevelt's political connections and media savvy ensured that newspaper correspondents followed his regiment closely, documenting their every move for eager American readers. The future president possessed genuine courage and leadership ability, but his hunger for military glory sometimes put his men at unnecessary risk. As American forces advanced towards Santiago through the Cuban jungle, The Rough Riders would soon face their baptism of fire in the first major land battle of the war, where Roosevelt's quest for martial fame would meet the deadly reality of modern warfare. The Battle of Las Guasimas on June 24, 1898, marked the first significant land engagement between American and Spanish forces in Cuba. General Joseph Wheeler's dismounted cavalry division, including the Rough Riders and regular cavalry units, encountered Spanish defenders in dense jungle terrain that negated many advantages of American numerical superiority. The Spanish forces, well-trained in guerrilla warfare and intimately familiar with local conditions, used smokeless powder rifles that made their positions difficult to locate, while American troops revealed themselves with every shot from their black powder weapons. Roosevelt and his men found themselves under accurate sniper fire from invisible enemies, a terrifying introduction to modern warfare for volunteers who had expected glorious cavalry charges. The confused engagement saw American units firing at each other in the thick vegetation, while Spanish troops conducted a skillful fighting withdrawal that inflicted casualties while avoiding decisive battle. Despite claiming victory, when Spanish forces evacuated their positions, American commanders realized their troops were ill-prepared for jungle warfare against experienced enemy soldiers. The battle served as a harsh education for American forces, revealing serious deficiencies in training, equipment, and tactical doctrine that would need immediate correction before the assault on Santiago. The assault on San Juan Heights on July 1, 1898, represented the climactic land battle of the Cuban campaign, as American forces launched a frontal attack against Spanish defensive positions overlooking Santiago de Cuba. General Shafter's plan called for simultaneous attacks on Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, the two key positions dominating the approaches to the city. The battle began with an ill-conceived balloon reconnaissance that drew Spanish artillery fire directly onto advancing American columns, causing unnecessary casualties before the assault even began. Regular army units of the 24th and 25th Infantry, composed of African-American soldiers, advanced steadily up the slopes under withering rifle fire from Spanish trenches. Roosevelt's Rough Riders joined the attack on Kettle Hill, with their charismatic leader conspicuously mounted on his horse Little Texas, making himself a prime target for enemy marksmen. The Spanish defenders, armed with modern Mauser rifles and positioned in well-constructed trenches, initially held their ground against the American onslaught. However, American numerical superiority and determination gradually overwhelmed Spanish resistance. The capture of the heights after fierce fighting opened Santiago to direct assault and marked the beginning of the end for Spanish resistance in Cuba. Following their defeat at San Juan Heights, Spanish forces in Santiago found themselves trapped between American land forces and the naval blockade that had sealed their fate. General Arsenio Liñas, wounded in the fighting, passed command to General José Toral, who faced the impossible task of defending a city cut off from reinforcement or resupply. The Spanish garrison numbered approximately 12,000 men, but many were weakened by tropical diseases and demoralized by their recent defeats. American forces under General Shafter began siege operations, positioning artillery on the captured heights to bombard Spanish positions and the city below. The civilian population of Santiago suffered terribly as food supplies dwindled and sanitation systems collapsed under wartime conditions. Admiral Cervera's fleet remained trapped in Santiago Harbor, unable to escape past the American naval blockade, but too powerful to ignore. Spanish authorities in Cuba faced a desperate choice: attempt a breakout that would likely result in the destruction of their remaining naval forces, or surrender the fleet intact to avoid further bloodshed. The siege created unbearable pressure on Spanish decision-makers, who understood that losing Santiago would effectively end Spanish resistance in Cuba and determine the war's outcome. Admiral Cervera faced the most difficult decision of his naval career as Spanish resistance in Santiago crumbled around him. His 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers represented Spain's last significant naval force in the Caribbean, but they were trapped in Santiago Harbor by a superior American fleet commanded by Rear Admiral William T. Sampson and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley. Cervera understood that attempting to break out would result in the destruction of his squadron, but remaining in harbor would simply delay the inevitable while allowing American forces to capture his ships intact. Spanish honor demanded that the fleet attempt to fight its way to freedom rather than surrender without battle. On July 3, 1898, Cervera received orders from Spanish authorities to attempt a breakout, despite his protests that the mission was suicidal. The admiral gathered his captains for a final conference, explaining that they would sortie at maximum speed in hopes of outrunning the American blockade, rather than engaging in decisive battle. Every Spanish officer understood they were likely sailing to their deaths, but military duty and national honor left them no alternative. As dawn broke on July 3rd, Cervera's ships began raising steam for their desperate dash toward the open sea and almost certain destruction. The Battle of Santiago Bay erupted on the morning of July 3, 1898, as Admiral Cervera's Spanish squadron attempted its desperate breakout from Santiago Harbor. The Spanish ships emerged from the narrow channel in single file, immediately coming under devastating fire from the waiting American fleet. Cervera's flagship, Infanta Maria Teresa, led the column, followed by the Vizcaya, Cristobal Colon, and Almirante Oquendo, with 3 destroyers bringing up the rear. Admiral Sampson's flagship New York was absent, coaling at Guantanamo, leaving Commodore Schley in tactical command aboard the Brooklyn. The American ships Iowa, Indiana, Oregon, and Texas joined Brooklyn in pursuit as Spanish vessels turned westward along the coast in hopes of outrunning their pursuers. The engagement became a running gunfight as American firepower systematically destroyed the Spanish squadron. The Infanta Maria Teresa and Almirante Oquendo were the first to succumb, driven ashore in flames after suffering direct hits to their ammunition magazines. The Vizcaya followed shortly after, leaving only the Cristobal Colon to continue the hopeless flight westward. The destruction of Spain's Caribbean fleet in less than 4 hours eliminated the last obstacle to American victory in the war's primary theater of operations. The destruction of Admiral Cervera's fleet at Santiago Bay effectively ended Spanish hopes of prolonging the war through naval resistance. With their Caribbean squadron eliminated and Santiago under siege by land forces, Spanish authorities in Cuba faced inevitable defeat unless reinforcements arrived from Europe, an impossibility given American naval dominance. General Toral opened surrender negotiations with American commanders on July 10th, seeking terms that would preserve Spanish military honor while ending the bloodshed that served no strategic purpose. The negotiations proved complex because Spanish forces throughout eastern Cuba were involved, not just the Santiago garrison. American commanders demanded unconditional surrender of all Spanish forces in the region, approximately 24,000 men, along with their weapons and equipment. Spanish negotiators sought permission for their forces to return to Spain with their personal weapons and regimental colors, traditional honors accorded to defeated but valorous enemies. After days of diplomatic maneuvering, both sides reached agreement on terms that satisfied Spanish honor while achieving American strategic objectives. The surrender ceremony would mark the end of organized Spanish resistance in Cuba and confirm American victory in the war's primary theater, though fighting continued in other Spanish colonies across the Pacific. While American forces achieved decisive victory in Cuba, the war's Pacific theater presented different challenges as U.S. troops faced the complex task of occupying the Philippine Islands. Following Dewey's naval victory at Manila Bay, American ground forces under General Wesley Merritt arrived to capture Manila and establish military government over Spain's most valuable Asian colony. The situation was complicated by Filipino revolutionary forces under Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been fighting for independence from Spain and viewed American occupation with suspicion. Aguinaldo's guerrilla army controlled much of Luzon Island outside Manila, creating a three-way political dynamic between Spanish colonial authorities, American occupiers, and Filipino nationalists. The Battle of Manila on August 13, 1898, was largely a prearranged affair, as Spanish forces offered token resistance before surrendering to preserve their honor while avoiding unnecessary casualties. American commanders deliberately excluded Filipino forces from the city's capture, foreshadowing future conflicts over Philippine independence. The occupation of Manila gave America its first major overseas territory and established the United States as a Pacific power. But it also created the conditions for a prolonged insurgency that would test American imperial ambitions in the coming years. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally ended the Spanish-American War and confirmed America's emergence as a global imperial power. Spanish negotiators, led by Foreign Minister Eugenio Montero Rios, faced the humiliating task of surrendering their nation's remaining overseas empire to the victorious Americans. The treaty terms were harsh, but reflected the military realities created by Spanish defeats in both the Caribbean and Pacific theaters. Spain agreed to grant Cuba its independence under American protection, while ceding Puerto Rico and Guam directly to the United States as compensation for war expenses. The most controversial provision involved the Philippines, which Spain sold to America for $20 million, despite Filipino expectations of immediate independence following their alliance with American forces against their colonial masters. The U.S. Senate debated the treaty intensely, with anti-imperialist senators arguing that overseas colonies violated American democratic principles and would entangle the nation in foreign conflicts. Supporters countered that America needed overseas bases and markets to compete with European powers in the coming century. The treaty's ratification by a single vote margin confirmed America's transformation from a continental republic into a world empire with responsibilities spanning 2 oceans. The Spanish-American War's conclusion marked a watershed moment in world history, as Spain's 4-century-old empire finally collapsed, while the United States emerged as a major global power. The conflict lasted only 4 months, but reshaped the geopolitical balance across 2 oceans, establishing America as the dominant force in the Caribbean and a significant player in Asian affairs. Cuban independence came at the price of American influence, while Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines became American territories, creating new responsibilities and challenges for a nation historically opposed to overseas colonialism. The war demonstrated the importance of naval power in the modern era, as control of the seas determined victory in both theaters of operation. American military performance, despite logistical problems and disease casualties, proved that the United States could project power globally and defeat European opponents. However, the acquisition of overseas territories, particularly the Philippines, would soon involve America in a prolonged insurgency that tested imperial ambitions and democratic principles. The war established precedents for American international intervention that would influence foreign policy for decades to come. The Spanish-American War thus represents both the end of Spain's imperial age and the beginning of America's rise to world power status. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.